very pleased to be able to speak with Ralph Echemendia, one of the world's renowned experts on cybersecurity and where it's taking us all. But also, your blurb, your tagline says technical advisor to Oliver Stone. What were the movies that you worked on, and how much of that sort of required you to sort of imagine a little bit into the future about how cybersecurity would evolve?
Well, I've worked on 2 movies with Oliver. Savages was the first of the movies that I worked on, and that movie was mainly about 2 weed dealers and the Mexican cartel, and it was more of a crime drama type of film, but it had an element of a hacker in there in a couple of different places. And a lot of it is Oliver's very, from his perspective as far as how he works, is he wants things to be very legitimate and very much like real life. Okay. So that was, it's not just a matter of the stuff that you see on the screen, but in working with the script itself and the writing and making sure that the kind of language being used is
legit,
right kind, the way we speak.
Yes.
And then the other aspect of it was with Snowden, and that one was a lot more involved than Savages, obviously because of the nature of the content itself. So very early on, even before the Snowden disclosures happened, Oliver already knew that he wanted to do something in that direction, so I took him to...
So I guess the people who watched Snowden wanted to know that you were technically correct about how he...
Well, we were conscious of the fact that people are going to go watch it who worked at the NSA and worked for the U.S. government, and that we didn't really, he didn't really want it to be, like it looks like Star Trek. But at the same time, there's a balance to be reached with entertainment because, and I think that was the main thing for myself, was to work with Oliver, with Kieran Fitzgerald, who was the writer, to work with the art direction, production design, to make sure that it wasn't too far off into the future,
right,
as far as how it looked.
Right.
Because the reality of it is most of these facilities are very boring.
Boring, yeah, exactly.
But at the same time that it was entertaining, and so there's a balance to be reached between both reality and...
And what about Nerve?
Nerve was actually more of a let's think up of something, because Nerve was a movie where they came to me and said, look, this is the producer who actually passed away recently, unfortunately, but she did the Hunger Games. And so, in this case, they had this storyline, this idea to make this movie about an app. And the first thing they told me is, we want you to approach it as if we were actually creating this app for real, even though it's for this to supply the storyline.
Right.
And so, it was the concept of a truth or dare, but without the truth, just a dare app.
Okay.
And then they would come up with a story, and then they basically had certain things like, we want you to come up with a way to design it that would make it so it would be impossible to take it down. So it can't be centralized. It had to be a decentralized application. Interestingly enough, as we're talking about money and cryptocurrency and all this, a decentralized app that teenagers would use to dare other teenagers.
Yes.
And one would be a player and one would be a watcher.
Right.
And the watchers watch to, pay to watch, and the players get paid to play. And that was kind of very interesting, since again we're talking cryptocurrency, and so that was the concept. And then as they went through different iterations of the script, and then it came back to, okay, now we need you to come up with a way to take it down.
Okay, so let's keep our imaginations going on that one. A lot of the apps today are created on open platforms, on open programming tools and such, open source. And then you don't want them to take it down. So what is the average app developer up against in terms of creating platforms which allows kids to develop apps around that and at the same time not take it down?
Well, the adoption of development for languages and for projects has to do, the reason open source I think exists and is an interesting model is because if you make it where everyone can see the code, unlike a lot of the commercial software, which does not allow you to do that, you can't see the compiled code. With open source, the idea was that will attract more programmers, and then whatever they put in, why? Because a lot of the same functionality that I need, you probably need, but then you might need some additional functionality which only adds to the value of the product. And because it's transparent, because it's open source, because you can see it, that would also allow people to look at it and find flaws. And so the argument is made that with open source, with certain open source projects, it actually is better security-wise than commercially closed software, because you can see the flaw and you can fix the flaw and you can report the flaw, and it's all part of the open source process.
So how much of that is the community policing the flaw?
It is all about the community, policing the community.
It's like a village in Cuba, like every neighbor knows what the other neighbor is doing. So
it's the old lady.
looking out of the window, and if you came home at 3 o'clock and not 4 o'clock, something's not right.
Yeah.
So
and that's the CCTV, that's
right.
the camera system.
Yeah.
And it is that way, and where, if everything was closed and you don't have that and it's just buildings that have a door but no windows, then you don't really have that kind of viewing points and vantage points. So that's the value of open source, and now we've seen it over the last 20 years where it's led from, initially starting in the open source realm and then taking a commercial approach too. So companies like Red Hat, for example, with Linux, where Linux is an open source kernel, but Red Hat is a commercial company that provides the other mechanisms that corporations and companies need. You need to hold somebody accountable. You can't just go, I'm going to...
Linux worked because eventually it became the critical, it had its own critical mass. It became the de facto open source platform, and all of the others sort of, tapered off and, disappeared into the background. But what if you get a situation where you have multiple,
well, you
platforms?
do have that with Linux. So, for example, Linux isn't really an operating system. Linux is the kernel. It's the thing that talks to the hardware. But then you have, several, dozens different versions of Linux. Some that are completely open source with no commercial entity involved, and some that are like Red Hat and a lot of others that have a commercial entity that then was built around it to provide maintenance support and certain things that are required to do business with it. Technically, they can all do the same business, but there are things required by business to have in place. So that's why Linux took off, and it just, again, it had the adoption of the development community more so than other ones. Again, you have BSD, you have other operating systems that also are similar in that way and also have a pretty large adoption.
So if I gave you a sentence that said Linux is a lot more robust because it's open source and and therefore less,
It's not to say that it's more secure or less secure than saying something like Windows, right? It's not.
Windows is interesting because Windows is a monolith. It's a structure. You got to take it as it's been given, and that's where the hackers go in there and they look for the holes, right? Whereas Linux is more like a living organism. Like if you find a hole, it's like someone plugs it in and keeps going.
It's. Ultimately, it's become that both of us. You could argue both. Because the truth is that there's more vulnerabilities found in Linux than there is found in Windows these days. But at the same time, because of that sort of open source community environment, they also are plugged and reported much faster, right? So if you took somebody who's knowledgeable in, say, a Windows environment and somebody who's knowledgeable in a Linux environment, they can probably both build just as a secure version of their own operating system. The problem is that oftentimes you have people who are not so knowledgeable with Linux, and by default it's too wide open, right? So they don't know exactly what they're doing. And the same thing could be said if you brought somebody from a Unix or Linux environment to a Windows environment. So it really isn't about as much the technology as much as it is the people behind it.
Now let's deploy that thinking into blockchain, right? Mm-hmm. Now we've only started to see the initial iterations of blockchain where the players are, a lot of the activities on the blockchain itself.
Yeah.
But there will come a point where the applications will be developed on top of the blockchain, and then it starts beginning to look like an API platform.
Yeah. Well, yes, blockchain is really just the backbone, if you will, to the beast, the animal that the application that's going to run on top of it. And so it's utility versus application, and blockchain is a utility, sort of like the power.
But that's not how.
How are you going to use the power? Turn on a light.
Right.
So then, do we make light bulbs, or do we make TVs? Like, what is the application of that power? in this case, we're using electricity as an analogy to blockchain. So blockchain is really a utilitarian type of technology that then now is being, the application right now is cryptocurrency. That's what everybody knows.
Yes, but they're trying to put on smart contracts, and then after that there will be applications on top of that. There will be communities of blockchains.
Absolutely, there'll be. I mean, it's it's very much, I think, where we are today with blockchain is where we were 25 years ago with the internet. Is the truth. It's I could remember when you could watch a TV program like this, and basically the reporter would be laughing about this thing called an email, and then you can actually find this stuff on YouTube. And they're making a joke about what is this symbol. They didn't even know to say @
Right.
And everybody joked about it. And
yes.
now we can't live without email.
Yes.
So blockchain is that.
At that phase, yeah.
We are, blockchain right now is what email was 25 years ago, which not many people got it. And not many people had one, and not many people knew how to use one. But, I think the difference is that here we are 20 years later, now we all have one, if not 10. And that's what's happening with blockchain. The only thing is, it ain't going to happen in 10 or 20 years. It's going to happen in 2.
Okay, I want to talk to you about 3 things here. One is how much of the intelligence should sit on open platforms. You were talking about kernels. Is the idea to keep the core small and simple, and then have the applications take a lot more of the intelligence, so that if there is a break-in or a fraud, it's contextualized. It doesn't affect the whole lot. How do you make it less brittle?
I'll put it in real simple terms. And I'm sure you've all heard this before. Blockchain is just a general ledger.
Yep.
It's just a ledger. I'll put it in even simpler terms. It's just a log. Okay, so we have those doors where you badge in, and they have a log of who badged in at what time. That's all blockchain really is, right? And of course, it's a lot more powerful than that, and what you can do with it. But ultimately, it's using that technology to use it to badge in. And so it's really as complex as its math is. It's really a simple utility, like electricity. So yes, the intelligence, if you will be built upon that from the perspective of its application and usage. So yeah, most of the, let's call it heavier code will happen in the application layers than on the blockchain itself.
And that's what we should be aspiring to.
I think it's just a natural tendency.
The reason I ask you this question is because all of the different blockchain initiatives at the moment are very proprietary. Everybody wants to be the final determinant of blockchain. Everyone's trying to win that first prize of being the Linux of blockchain kind of thing. That there will be, there will be ubiquitous and all that. So we're not there yet. So right now, so the intelligence is still being maintained at the core. So.
I think, again, coming from the sort of hacker subculture and very much for open source technology from a very early age, I think that's not the right step to move. And there's a saying that often comes to mind when we start getting into the right or wrongs of things, which is, regardless of your background, upbringing, religious, whatever it may be, the truth is it's just an evolutionary process. So evolutionarily speaking, if
yes.
you will, scientifically speaking, there is no right or wrong. It's just part of the process of evolving. And I think blockchain is definitely a technology that is helping us evolve, but the mentality of proprietary, as you put it, is not in the best interest of anyone.
Okay. Second point is frictionless. Right? The whole idea is to make a lot of the applications as frictionless as possible, get the passcodes out of the way, get all the authentication process out of the way. What gives and what needs to be protected in that process?
Well, I think the biggest, the main thing is to verify identity, because that's really it. How the whole idea behind what blockchain can do is to keep, again, that ledger, to keep that log of who's done what. And one thing that I can tell you certainly from doing hacking of penetration testing of all kinds of different systems, including financial systems, is that it's very easy to modify that log. Now, therein lies the value of blockchain. So blockchain is written to be more secure than non-blockchain technology.
And that's because the identity is non-reputable. And you can't repudiate a identity.
Yes, but as we get into frictionless, which really has more to do with the user experience of the use of the application, not so much the blockchain, right?
Right.
So,
and at that point, the user, and there we get into this whole, where's identity going? Because the user can have multiple identities, and there's also this big philosophical war that the user protects his own identity, like he gives it to who he wants and stuff like that, right? So
well, it's what I like to refer to as selective disclosure.
Yeah.
Because what I believe is private to me may be different to you, and is different to every individual. They may believe or they may see certain things to be quote unquote private, but privacy is really about what I select to be, to disclose and not disclose. Obviously, to be able to operate, to be able to have a conversation with you, I must disclose something. But you might ask a question I might choose not to answer. So that simple issue right there is exactly what.
So as a hacker, what are you saying? What are you saying? What are you thinking about where identity is going? Like if you're hacking someone's identity, or even promoting a personal identity out there, what's happening on that?
Well,
front?
the problem is right, at least right now. Okay, and again, that's where the power lies of how this kind of technology will. Again, keep in mind this is not even a baby yet; it's a fetus, right? So but the power lies in right now. Identity management or identity theft is very simple because all we're doing is storing it in a database. And so if I have every single piece of information that is required for me to open a bank account, buy a car, so on and so forth, right? Any of the financial mechanisms that exist, if it allows me to use any of those financial mechanisms, right now most of the data required for me to be you, I can answer if I have access to that database. And your data is in so many places right now that you can't even really fathom.
Yep.
So if I hacked into these places and if I had all this data, and it really came down to the challenge of prove you're you, how would you prove you're you? Because I can even change your fingerprints. Put my fingerprints in that database and say that my name is yours. So therein lies the problem right now. And I think that the hope is that the solution lies in blockchain.
Is blockchain an interim solution?
I don't.
Because everyone's talking it. It's just that. See,
I don't think it's an interim solution. I think it is it's a means to a means in the sense that the idea behind the science and math behind blockchain is what is supposed to allow it to be not so easily modifiable. And it really isn't.
So blockchain is a deployment issue, which as a purist, as a hacker, you probably see it. It's just that it is that the institutions that are trying to promote blockchain have got a big back end, like a compliance and a KYC and
they have a
which is a
legacy problem.
Yeah, and then you don't know where the authentication process actually operates. Like,
well, I think that look at the end of the day, and I think this is as long as time. When you have the bigger the animal, the slower it moves.
Yeah,
so,
and tell us a little bit about the institutions that you work with and how they sort of trying to deal.
Well,
with
obviously the bigger institutions here, for example, we're at a banking conference for the most part. There's a financial technology conference, and we're talking about major players here, that are responsible for so much of our transactionability on a daily basis. Well, those are big animals, and they're going to move very slow to they have figured out they have to move with the adoption of this technology because it's already happened. But then they're not fully understanding. I love that we tend to use the word new, and almost immediately, a second after, try to fit it into the old. This is new, and what is coming is completely new. So I think money, as we know it today, is going away, and I'm not necessarily qualified to say what it's going to be. I don't think even executive of a bank is qualified to say what it's going to be. In fact, more the contrary. I think the visionaries are in these small startup companies who are figuring out how to add this application layer to the blockchain.
So there, the philosophical, conceptual issue that not just the big companies, but businesses in general have to get over is that blockchain puts the entire authentication, legitimacy of the transaction on the front end where everyone's playing. There is no back end to talk about. So, it's like you have to give up.
Centralized back end, which is kind of what we're used to with even the concept of your money being in a bank. Your money's in your wallet, and and your wallet goes with you unless you put your wallet up somewhere, which is called an exchange. And that's it. And so technically speaking, a lot of people, with all these hacks and ICOs and all these different things, and they, it's a very simple answer where for the conventional, money as we know it now, it's not that simple of an answer. How do I keep this? How do I be more safe and secure? Well, don't take your wallet out.
Yeah.
Don't carry your wallet, and don't only use your wallet for when you need to use your wallet. So
and legislation that protects the data. That is, there are legislation, the EU, for example, where the data belongs to the customer, right? And the customer decides who he wants to give it to, when he wants to give it to, and this whole thing about the right to be forgotten.
I think that I believe in to some degree in the right to be forgotten, but I think that the concept, we are not aware enough, we're not educated, at least right now. And again, things are evolving alongside with it, but you give the power to the people that of something they don't quite understand, and chances are that they'll give that power away. And that's what the
and they've been doing that all the time from the days of the password, right?
They're still doing it. That's the whole thing. They're doing it with something as simple as a password. So without enough of an understanding, like I said, of honestly, we can't even properly, on a global scale, identify or describe what privacy means. So, there's a lot of cultural issues involved. So I think there's a number of things that we have to overcome to define these things. And then once as people really understand that, this isn't a microwave. You don't need to know how the food got hot. You just hit the buttons and hit start. And this isn't that. You have to have some level of understanding, because this is your identity. This is your life. And as we move forward, like I said, I can become you very easily right now. I think blockchain does have the potential to make that risk less.
As a hacker, as a proud hacker, top 3 hacks that you found very interesting lately?
Well, that I've done, or that I've found in general?
Well, what you've done, I guess I have to pay you for that or something.
Well, they vary. I think, back to, there's the technical hacks, and if we got into that specifically, it's not digestible by most people. But I think, like I said, the big problem here is the people. The weakest link in this chain is the humans. It's what we call wetware. And as I mentioned in my talk today, there's no patch for human stupidity. You can patch hardware and you can patch the software, but you can't patch the fact that by default. Like leaving the door open and stuff, right? So it's just the way we're wired. So and the way we work. So yes, you can bring awareness and all that kind of stuff, but again, there's a kind of a default way.
Is that what a hacker looks for? Right? I mean, consciously looks for, or is there a way a hacker can program a process?
It's not all programming. I mean, it's a method of it's a kind of a way of thinking more than anything else. I think there are many people who, by our definition, are hackers in different areas like legal or psychology or even finance. But it's really more of a way of thinking, and it's about learning how to learn about something you know nothing about. One way to explain it is the traits that make up. There's 4 kinds of people in the world. The whole world is made of only 4 types: people who know and do, people who don't know and do, people who don't know and don't do, and people who know and don't do.
Okay.
And hackers are made up of people who don't know and do, and people who know and do. They're doers, and they start usually off by knowing nothing. What hackers are really good at is getting very deep into a subject, a technology, a person, whatever it is, very quickly, and reverse engineering that to a level that most people don't do in that time frame. If they can do it in an hour, whether it's 2 weeks or 2 months, to learn a programming language on your own, that's the mentality.
And the gratification?
The gratification is you're bored, and you need to spend your time on something. That's it. That's generally what it's about. Is that you are, I think
That's why
we've tended to give it names like ADD and ADD. No, you're bored. You're just bored, and you have that kind of mentality where if your mind isn't working on something and figuring something out, then it's bored. And
that's why the best hackers come out of Siberia in the middle of winter, or Pakistan.
Yeah, they've got nothing to do. Their brains are working, and the computer is connected to the entire world. So,
thank you very much, Ralph.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.